Hey everyone, welcome back to Lumber Capital Log Yard. If you haven't watched my previous video, This Event Changed Our Lives, then I would recommend watching that one first. I will leave a link to it in the description down below. Also, check out our merch shop for cool t-shirts and hats. Before we get into why this event has changed our lives, the boss is going to talk a little bit about our new log site.
We just came up a mountain. We're about 500 feet up from the road, and I think Em got some footage down at the bottom. It's January. What's today? The 6th.
January the 6th.
5th or 6th. We should have had frost in the ground a very, very, very long time ago, and it has been extremely wet. And we put a large amount of time and money into permitting for the current log site that we're on. And the ingress and egress where Em was filming down below, it just won't work. It's January 6th and there's water laying on the landing coming out of the ground. So we've had a lot of rain again and very little frost. Now, I said we came up about 500 feet, and there's a very thin veneer layer of frost in the ground, which is very comfortable and perfect working conditions. We can stay out in the mud. The machine will perform well. We're not going to put a skidder on this site. It's only 16 or 17 acres. We're just going to use the dozer. There's a forestry package on the dozer. I don't know if you can see it, but we have limb risers. The blade has some extra artillery on the front to keep logs from rolling over the front of the blade. And then we have a big 40,000 pound winch on the back. So
40,000 pounds.
we'll use this machine to skid, and then this will be the landing. So I am very happy because now I am high and dry, and that is where you want to be during a flood. You want to be high and dry, right? So I just want to say thanks. We're actually on somebody else's property currently that we will not be harvesting for, but he was gracious enough to allow us to use just this small portion of his property, and then a road to access it.
Okay, so how did the flood affect our business specifically?
I already addressed this a little bit the last time I was in a video, and I really hope this is the last time I do this, but I told Em I'd be willing to do this again. There were a lot of comments, very kind words said about the flood video, and I felt compelled to spend a little time in front of these devices again to give a little explanation. How did it affect the business? The number one way, and the saddest thing to me was my saw shop was in the basement. And that's not something that Em mentioned in the video, and she probably wouldn't have thought of unless I had mentioned it to her. We had a lot of old chainsaws in the basement. That doesn't sound like that big a deal, but those saws become worth more in parts than the saw itself. It's hard to believe, just to go for a handle or a bar across the top, or so many of the cosmetic things we damage in the woods just from wear and tear, and to be able to go grab that saw and tear it apart and get a part off it immediately in the evening instead of having it overnighted at a large cost in parts and shipping. It was very disappointing to lose those assets. We also lost hundreds of feet of chainsaw chain I have traditionally bought my chainsaw chain in 100-foot spools and then make my own loops. So as soon as that chain is wet with flood mud, people tried to clean it, and it became scrap metal. It wasn't worth it. The edges dull quickly because of the rust, and then just the massive amount of sand and grit with flood mud is just, it's not something you necessarily expect, but it was unsalvageable. So we lost thousands and thousands of dollars in parts and chains and things like that, and it really set us back, because you go to grab a part and you don't have it. That was very disheartening to me. We also were out of our home, I think, for 3 months, just under 3 maybe, and then not having a base to really work, to be able to repair saws and just, you know, little things like that, you know, like my grinder for taking burrs off of chokers or anything like that you had no idea you even owned. You took for granted, or you know, you just accumulated over time, and even if you used it incidentally, when you go to use it and it's not there, it's another trip to the hardware store, and that becomes very costly very fast. The second thing that is very germane to the flood is, because it was such a wet season, extremely wet, we started cutting railroad ties on our first lumber mill, the LT15, and we cut many ties. I think we were doing about 160 a month, which of course is not a large number, but when you consider it was done on an LT15, and I was able to just stand there and put my back into it when I couldn't be in the woods, it became quite a blessing to us. We didn't cut any lumber off the railroad tie logs. We only cut the cant. A railroad tie log is the cant, the squared up cant that the railroad buys. There's generally 3 sizes. There's a 6/8, a 7/8, and a 7/9. A 7/9's always the tie you need to cut. You need about a 12.5-inch diameter.
Why is that? Why is it the 7/9 that you cut?
The 7/9 is the money tie, and that is your primary cross tie on a railroad. And I'm talking a cargo railroad. The passenger may be different. They have different requirements. Now in north central Pennsylvania, our ties are the oak family, the maple family. You can cut hickory. That's very hard wood to cut for a railroad tie, just because of the density of the wood. And where we are located is primarily oak. I don't know if them can pan around, but we have an oak tree, an oak tree, an oak tree, an oak tree. This is all oak, and then we have hemlock, and there's a few pine in here. As we get down below, there's some walnut, which I'm very excited to cut.
Ooh.
Yeah, very beautiful wood. So that is the primary way how it affected the business, as far as changing the direction that I was in. I hadn't used that mill. I think I said in a previous video that the reason we owned it was the local, I don't know if it was the township or the county, required us to be classified as a lumber mill, to do firewood at the log yard, the current log yard. So I had to go out and buy a lumber mill, and I bought the smallest one and the cheapest one I could find, plopped it in a corner to meet the requirement to use the property to sell firewood from. And that went like I said, in flood year 2011, to so many days that I just am standing around scratching my head. I want to work, I like to work, and I don't want to sit at home. So I'm standing at the log yard and I'm looking at that mill, and I'm looking at what log availability we have, and we were able to turn that into a blessing that changed the course of the future. I didn't expect to run a lumber mill, nothing more than possibly incidentally, and that changed to us now being on our 4th mill, and hoping to expand again, possibly in the next 2 or 3 years to the next size up, a little more production, and a little more, ideas and versatility with a larger machine.
All right, so we talked about why or how it has affected our business, but now how has it affected our lives outside of the business? I probably know this more than the business aspect, but
Em wants to get, I don't know, she wants to get me choked up here.
I don't mean to.
I'll say this. A man is lucky in life if he has 1 or 2 opportunities to rise to an occasion. And whether a man does or a man doesn't, that's something he has to live with. And I was presented with an opportunity. The thought wasn't for myself, it was saving my family. And I can't really speak a lot about how it affected the family. I can say it, maybe a couple things. It's probably how it affected me. It takes a while to develop character. You aren't always sure who you are, maybe. I don't know. I don't think I was certain at that time. And I'll say this, just to take a step back. I also I didn't have a complete understanding of what I valued. And that might even sound selfish, but that's the fact of it. You're moving along, you're struggling. We made it through 2008 with the housing collapse, and I'm working a lot of hours, and I'm pushing, trying to grow a business, and I have a family that's young and growing up, and a lot of my energy was put into just survival financially. And then I'm faced with the survival of my family, and it became, there's no question from that day forward, my value system changed. The reason I do things, all this, it can burn to the ground, and it doesn't really matter. But she's my value.
So, as I understand it,
She's interrupting me.
After our house flooded, we lived in it for another about 7 years before we ended up moving. But as I understand it, you were never fully comfortable with living in that house after that happened.
No, I couldn't wait for the opportunity to sell the place. When Terry and I bought the house, I bought it because it's absolutely an incredibly beautiful area. We're near a large creek. Of course, that's the creek that flooded. But the house hadn't flooded in the 2 or 3 major flood years. Water could get close, but there was no issue.
Not even in the basement.
Not even in the basement. So I had when I bought the place, I was like, oh, you're close to the water, that's awesome. It doesn't flood. It's beautiful here. It's it's just a nice place to be. But when that happened, all of a sudden, every time it's raining, you're on the computer watching the flood gauges up above you, and for any telltale sign. And I guess I became a little gun shy about it, and the first opportunity that presented itself, I called Terry and I said, let's get this place listed and get out of here.
So what was the thing with the flood? We were taken out of the flood zone. So were we put in the flood? The house was able to sell because it was not considered to be in the flood zone.
I don't know that this is all that interesting, but they actually redrew the flood map, and the house was completely removed. It was very marginal whether it was in a flood zone or not, which meant you had to have flood insurance on the house, which Terry and I did, even though the house had never flooded. But they redrew the map after this horrific flood, after the house had flooded, and when they redrew the map, the house was completely out of the flood zone. And she called and said that a paper had shown up saying so, and I said, call a realtor. We sat down the next day with the realtor, signed a contract, and within 2 weeks, the house was sold. And I am delighted to this day that we are out of there and don't live there.
And now we live on top of a mountain. Convenient.
Yeah, if it floods now,
The world is ending.
it is not going to be a good thing. So,
All right. Well,
yeah, more questions, or do I have to do this again?
everybody likes seeing it.
Right, everybody likes seeing it except for me. Thank you for the kind comments. I appreciate it. I'm sure all of you would have done the same thing had you found yourself in that situation. And M&J's perspective, I guess that's pretty close to how I remember it, maybe plus or minus a few details that are sort of just incidental. So thank you for taking an interest, and don't really want to talk about this again for a long time.